Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Swordsman Online 101. Actually, before we get started, there's something about this channel that you may have noticed, and that's that I renamed it to the Lone Swordsman's Principle. And that's because I think that what I'm going to do is I will dedicate this channel entirely to the Swordsman Online tutorial series of Swordsman Online 101 and its series. But if I ever decide to record other games and play other games, I think I will make a different channel for that. So that's my decision for now. Maybe it will change in the future, but for now, I think I will just leave this channel for the Swordsman Online tutorial series entirely. So with that said, let's begin today's episode. So today will be kind of a different episode. Instead of talking about a single concept, we're going to be focusing on the miscellaneous status effects, like freezes, slows, ensnare, or root as they might call it, and things like this. The reason for that is each of these skills is too small to have a specific video dedicated to them, but at the same time, they're also important enough to not leave them out entirely. So this will be sort of a fragmented video where I'll talk about each status effect and then jump to the next one, but hopefully that will be okay since this will be the only one like this probably. Anyways, let's get started. Alright, the first skill we want to talk about is Immobilize. What it does is that, as the name implies, it immobilizes your opponent. But by immobilize, we don't mean that they can't do anything, but only that they can't walk around. So, as you can see, if my opponent is walking around, I can use them an immobilize skill, and my opponent will just stop moving, and they can't move around anymore, until the effects are off, then they can move around again. So, seems simple enough. But there is a caveat to immobilize. Is that while they're immobilized, they could still use their utility skills, that is to say, block or dodge. So you couldn't immobilize an opponent, but they could immediately dodge away, and then it would actually cancel the immobilize effect, and the dodge would still go off. So that is one downside of immobilize, is that even though they can't move, they could still use their utility skill if they have the stamina for it. However, one utility skill that they cannot use is jumps. So while they are jumping, you can actually immobilize them, and then they wouldn't be able to jump anymore until they actually are not immobilized anymore. So essentially, the only skill that they could use while immobilized is the status effect of utility skill of dodge. Next up, we have the slow status effect. The slow status effect is rather similar to the immobilize status effect, but there's also a lot of differences. So obviously by slow, we mean that they're not immobilized, they're just slowed, so they can still move around, but at a much slower pace, as the name implies, compared to if they weren't slowed. However, if they are slowed, they also cannot jump. Why? It's just how it is. They cannot jump while they're slowed, but they can still move around. They can also use their utility skill, like dodges, much like how Immobilize works, but unlike Immobilize, if they are slowed, dodging wouldn't get rid of the status effect, and they would have to wear off naturally. So you might also be interested to know that slow and freeze also has a counterpart. The counterpart to slow is called ice cold, and it works almost exactly like slow, except unlike slow, it can actually stack multiple times. And by stacking it, the more that you stack, the slower they get, until eventually they're at a walking pace. However, unlike unlike slow, you can still jump while you're ice coated. So next up, we also have Icebound, which is the counterpart to Immobilize, or Freeze as I sometimes call it. And it pretty much works exactly the same way as Immobilize, except for the fact that you can't even use utility skill while you are icebounded. So, unlike Ice Cold, which is debatable for whether or not it is comparable to Slow, Icebound is, in all sense of the word, a better version of Immobilize. The next skill we have is called Frozen. And no, not like the movie Frozen, but frozen in the sense that your opponent actually cannot do anything. So it's actually quite different from Immobilize, but literally your opponent is frozen. Now the frozen status effect is probably the more interesting status effect out of the ones we've talked about so far, because the frozen status effect is actually the closest you'll ever get to a stun in this game. When you're frozen, your opponent cannot do anything at all. They cannot use their utility skill, they cannot move, they can't attack, and additionally, unlike Acupuncture, you can attack them and it wouldn't remove the status effect. However, similar to Acupuncture and similar status effects, you cannot stack the frozen status effect with any other status effect like Acupuncture. So essentially, the frozen status effect act as both the Acupuncture and the follow-up hard launch or hard prone, all in one skill. However, there is one thing about the frozen status effect that you should be aware of. It's that you cannot stack two of them together, because that would obviously be way too overpowered. If you were to use the frozen effect once, and then it wears off, and then within the next 10 seconds you try to use a similar frozen effect, then nothing will happen. They'll take the damage, but they'll straight up be immune to it. Additionally, this doesn't only apply to if you hit them. If you simply block the first frozen effect, the second frozen effect will also not hit them, even if they weren't blocking. They will also be straight up immune as well. So that is one thing you have to be careful of when trying to use the frozen status effect. However, you will be glad to know that unlike Acupuncture or Daze, the frozen status effect actually does work on prone and launch targets. So you can freeze a target that is already proned or launched, but you cannot prone or launch a target that is frozen. So it is kind of special in its own way. Additionally, you should also note that like Acupuncture, the frozen status effect also goes through counter ready. Now, Attach is actually a very interesting status effect. It's not very intuitive, but here's how it works. Basically, when a skill attaches you, you're completely pulled towards the skill, and even if you try to move away from it, the skill will continuously pull you in towards it until, well, it goes away. So you're not exactly prevented from moving in the sense that you can still move, but every time you try to move, the skill will pull you back, so there's really no point in moving. However, that doesn't mean there's no way to escape the skill, because after all, your utility skills still work, so if you time it right, you can simply dodge out of the status effect of Attach. But time it wrong, however, and it will actually just pull you right back in, and you will have used the dodge regardless. So this is actually a really tricky status effect to deal with, and you really need to just get more experience to know when you can dodge and when you have to wait. So enough about negative status effects, let's talk about some positive ones. One of the positive status effects is called Accelerated, and it sort of acts like an anti-stun, which you might immediately think of traditional MMOs. However, it's not an anti-stun in the sense that you can be immune to Acupuncture or Prone or Daze or anything like that, but rather it's an anti-stun in the sense that it will make you immune to some of the status effects that we just mentioned in this video, like Immobilize or Slow. While you're accelerated, these status effects will not affect you, and you can go on moving. So, even though it might seem useful, the fact that it doesn't do anything against effects like Daze or Acupuncture is actually not that useful, if you think about it. However, there is one benefit of the status effect, is that it makes you immune to Attach status effects as well. So, in some very limited circumstances, this effect could come in handy. However, a more interesting status effect we want to talk about is the stable status effect. Now, the stable status effect actually can make you immune to effects like Daze. But on the other hand, it actually does not do anything against the status effect that we just talked about, like slow or immobilize. Now, the stable status effect is indicated by a yellow glow on your character. And while you are glowing yellow, any skill that would otherwise prone you will simply fail to do so, similar to how the accelerator worked for freeze or immobilize status effect. However, at the end of the day, nothing really works against acupuncture or grab, not even stable. Even stable will not make you immune to acupuncture. We also have a few status effects that are not affiliated with movements. The next one is disable. And what it does is that it makes you unable to use any skills. However, you can still use your regular attacks, but just not your skills. As you can see, your skills get crossed out and you simply can't use any of them. However, it is easy to fall into the trap of thinking that once you disable your opponent, you're safe from any follow-up attacks. However, that's not really the case. For one, your opponent can be casting the skill as you're casting your disable, and then the skill will land by the time your disable kicks in. The other thing is that even if you have your opponent disabled, your opponent could already be casting a skill in the first place, and they will continue casting even if they're disabled until the skill fully finishes. Finally, the duration of disable is actually pretty short, so even if you do manage to disable your opponent, if your opponent manages to land a status effect like Acupuncture on you, they still might be able to make use of it before your disable effect wears off. Finally, we have a skill called Blind, which makes your opponent's screen go mostly black, but it's actually not that good because they can still see you no matter how far they actually are away from you. The only thing they can't see is the area around them. So you might be able to, say, lay a trap, and then they might not be able to see it until they walk right up into you. But aside from that, for the most part, it won't really help you that much. There's also another skill called Root, or Ensnare, which, as far as I can tell, is pretty much exactly like Icebound. So I'm not actually sure why there's a distinction between Ensnare and Icebound, but for all intent and purposes, we will just treat Ensnare as being identical to Icebound for now. However, they are two different skills, and I suppose they might be able to stack, although that will never really happen since there isn't any single class with both Ensnare and Icebound. Now, there are some damage over time effects in this game, but for the most part, they're not really worth talking about, because as you can see, they only do minimal damage, and the result of the damage over time will never really affect the outcome of a fight, except in the most peculiar of cases, where maybe your opponent is on the last few hundred HP. But in that case, they would mostly be dead even without the damage over time effect anyway. So we can just pretend that damage over time does not really exist in Arena at all. So that's all for today. Just to recap, we've gone over Slow, Immobilize, Ice Cold, Icebound, Frozen, Attach, Accelerated, Stable, Disable, Blind, the damage over time effects, and Ensnare today. So thank you for watching, and see you next time.